You walk into the room and everyone knows their part. Someone laughs at the right moment, someone else leans in at the right moment, and you are there too, nodding, smiling, saying the thing that fits. But some small part of you is standing 3 feet behind your own body, watching yourself perform a person you're not entirely sure you agreed to be. You have the job, you have the family gathering, the friend group, the apartment with your name on the lease. By every visible measure, this is your life. So why does it feel like you're subletting it from someone else? You answer messages in a voice that isn't quite your voice. You have opinions you repeat because they're expected, not because you still believe them. You laugh half a second after everyone else because you're translating the moment before you can live it. At night, alone, something quieter surfaces, a version of you that doesn't perform, doesn't translate, doesn't wait for permission to feel what it feels. And then morning comes, and you put the other one back on. Maybe you've tried to explain this to someone before, and it came out sounding smaller than it is, ungrateful even. You have so much. Why does it feel like none of it is quite yours? This feeling has a name, and it isn't weakness. It isn't a flaw in your personality or a sign that something is broken in you. It is one of the oldest and most human alarms there is, a signal, not a sentence. It means a part of you is still awake enough to notice the gap between the life you're living and the life that's actually yours. The writer who understood this ache better than almost anyone was Fyodor Dostoevsky. He knew what it was to lose an entire identity overnight, sentenced to death for his beliefs, marched before a firing squad, and pulled back from execution only at the last possible second. Then sent to a Siberian prison camp among men who had nothing in common with the writer he'd been. He came back a different person, forced to rebuild a self almost from scratch. Out of that came one of his central insights, that a person can spend a whole life performing sincerity while never once being sincere, and that the moment you notice this, painful as it is not the crisis, it's the beginning of the cure. He didn't write comfortable answers. He wrote about people who felt exiled inside their own existence and what it actually took for them to come home to themselves. In the next several minutes, we're going to walk through 6 things Dostoevsky understood about why you feel like a stranger inside your own life. Not as literary trivia, but as a map you can actually use. We'll look at the part of you that quietly sabotages your own comfort. The freedom you've been running from without realizing it. The cost of the mask you didn't know you were still wearing. And the exact moment, the one almost everyone in this position eventually reaches, where the performance stops working. That moment is coming later in this video, and it changes everything before it. So stay with this one until the end, because the turning point isn't where you'd expect it, and neither is what waits on the other side of it. Chapter 1. The life you're renting. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded, co-workers, partner, a full calendar, a group chat that never sleeps, and still feel like a guest in your own house. Not unwanted, not unloved, just unaccounted for. As if the version of you that everyone interacts with is a stand-in, and the real one is somewhere in the wings, waiting to be called on and never quite getting the cue. This is not the same as sadness. Sadness has an object. You can point to what hurts. This feeling is stranger, quieter, harder to explain out loud, because when you try, it sounds like nothing is wrong. You have good things. You should feel like yourself, and yet you don't. Dostoevsky spent much of his writing life circling exactly this condition. His characters are rarely tormented by outside villains. They're tormented by a split within, a self that acts one way in public and knows, privately, that the acting has become the whole show. He suggested that the danger isn't in playing a role sometimes. Everyone does that. The danger is in forgetting you're playing one at all, in letting the performance quietly become the only self you have access to. Think about how this shows up in an ordinary week. You answer, "I'm good, just busy," to everyone who asks how you are. And after enough repetitions, you start to believe it's a complete answer, even as something underneath keeps insisting it isn't. You choose the safe opinion in a conversation, the one nobody will push back on, and you feel a small flicker of relief and a small flicker of shame at the exact same time. Relief that you avoided conflict, shame that you don't know anymore which opinion was actually yours to begin with. This is the outsider feeling in its earliest, most disguised form. It doesn't announce itself as alienation. It shows up as fatigue, as a strange flatness after a perfectly nice evening, as the sense, brushing your teeth at midnight, that you performed well today. And performed is the operative word. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Daniel. Daniel was, by every external account, doing everything right. Steady job, long relationship, a small circle of old friends he'd known since university. He was the one people called when they needed calm advice, because he always seemed to have it together. What none of them knew was that Daniel had not said a fully honest sentence about how he actually felt in almost 2 years. Not because he was hiding some enormous secret. There was no affair, no crime, no scandal. He was hiding something smaller and somehow harder to admit. He didn't know any more what he actually wanted. And he'd built an entire persona around never having to answer that question out loud. Every time someone asked, "How are you really?" Daniel gave the practiced version. "Fine, busy, good, actually." And every time he said it, the gap between the performance and the truth widened by another fraction of an inch. Until one evening, sitting at a dinner with the very friends who trusted him most, he realized he could not remember the last time he'd said something in that group that he hadn't first quietly approved for safety. He excused himself, stood in the bathroom, and looked in the mirror at a face that felt, in that moment, like it belonged to someone he was impersonating. That was not Daniel's breakdown. It was his first honest moment in 2 years. It felt like collapse, but it was actually the opposite. It was the outsider feeling doing its job, which is to interrupt a performance that has gone on so long it forgot it was a performance. Dostoevsky's insight cuts against a very modern instinct, which is to treat this feeling as a malfunction to fix, something to medicate away, distract from, or optimize out of your schedule. He would have argued the opposite. The discomfort of feeling like an outsider in your own life is not proof that something is wrong with you. It's proof that some part of you never fully agreed to disappear. That part is still in the room. It's still, in its own quiet way, keeping watch. There's a reason this feeling so often arrives quietly, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable life, rather than during an obvious crisis. Crisis gives you permission to feel like an outsider. Of course you'd feel disoriented after a loss, a diagnosis, a divorce. What's harder to metabolize is feeling exiled from your own life when nothing has visibly gone wrong. There's no event to point to, no one to blame. Just a slow, accumulating sense that the person answering to your name has drifted from the person actually living behind your eyes. This is precisely why so many people delay dealing with it. If you can't name a cause, it's tempting to conclude there's nothing real to address, that you're simply ungrateful or restless or asking for more than you deserve. Dostoevsky rejected this framing entirely. He treated the discomfort itself as data, not indulgence. A person who feels nothing when their life diverges from who they are isn't healthier than a person who feels the gap acutely. They've simply stopped listening to the part of themselves that used to protest. It helps to notice how gradual the drift usually is. Nobody wakes up one day having fully replaced themselves with a performance. It happens in 1,000 small trades, each one reasonable in isolation. You soften an opinion once to keep the peace. You say yes to something you didn't want, because saying no felt disproportionate to the request. You let a joke about your ambitions pass without correction, because correcting it felt like too much fuss over something small. None of these moments feels like betrayal at the time, but betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates the way sediment does, invisible day to day, undeniable once you finally step back and look at the shape it's built. Daniel's story, before the dinner table moment we'll return to later, was built almost entirely out of trades like these. He didn't choose in any single dramatic instant to become a stranger to himself. He simply kept picking the version of a response that required the least explanation, the least risk of disappointing someone, the least chance of being asked a harder follow-up question. Each of those choices felt survivable. It was only in aggregate, over years, that they added up to a life he no longer recognized as fully his own. The question this chapter leaves you with is not, how do I make this feeling go away? It's a harder, more useful question. Which parts of your daily performance are protecting you, and which parts have simply outlived their purpose and are now the thing keeping you a stranger to yourself? Chapter 2. The Man Underground. There's a particular voice most people carry that doesn't want them to have what they say they want. You set the goal, the honest conversation, the boundary, the version of your life you actually mean to build, and almost immediately, something in you starts working against it. Not loudly, not with dramatic self-destruction usually, more like a persistent undertow. The delay, the second-guessing, the small choice to numb out instead of show up, the joke that deflects the real thing you meant to say. Dostoevsky gave this voice its most famous portrait in a character often called the underground man, a bitter, isolated narrator who admits with painful honesty that he sabotages his own good precisely because it is his. He'd rather suffer on his own terms than be comfortable on someone else's, even when someone else simply means the ordinary demands of a decent life. There's a strange, defiant logic to it. If I ruin this myself, at least the ruin is mine. Nobody handed it to me. I authored it. This sounds irrational until you notice it in your own life. The relationship that was finally going well right before you started a fight over nothing. The project that was finally coming together right before you stopped answering emails about it. The moment of real closeness with someone right before you said something cutting, just sharp enough to put a little distance back between you. This isn't a character flaw unique to broken people. It's closer to a design feature of anyone who has ever been hurt by trusting something good and then losing it. The underground voice isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's an old form of protection, built by a younger version of you who learned at some point that hope is the thing that gets punished hardest. Sabotage feels safer than disappointment, because sabotage at least puts you back in control of when the bad thing happens. This is where modern psychology quietly agrees with a 19th century Russian novelist. Contemporary shame research describes something very close to this pattern: self-sabotage as a way of preemptively managing an old fear of not being enough, rather than a wish to fail. Attachment researchers see the same mechanism in relationships. People who withdraw or provoke conflict right when intimacy deepens, not because they don't want closeness, but because closeness reactivates the oldest fear they have. Different vocabulary, same underground room. What both traditions agree on, separated by more than a century, is that the sabotaging voice is not a verdict on your character. It's a strategy learned honestly from real experience that has simply outlived its usefulness. Understanding this doesn't dissolve the pattern overnight, but it does something important. It moves the sabotaging voice from proof that you are the problem to evidence of an old wound still trying to protect you the only way it knows how. Dostoevsky never asked his characters to silence that voice through sheer willpower. He asked them to recognize it, name it, and slowly stop obeying it as though it were the only voice in the room. Here is the part that matters most for the outsider feeling specifically. Every time you obey the underground voice instead of the voice that actually wants connection, meaning, or honesty, you widen the gap between your real self and your performed self a little further. You become, by small increments, more of a stranger to your own life. Not because life rejected you, but because you kept letting an old fear cast the deciding vote on who gets to show up. The underground man in Dostoevsky's story stays underground. That is the tragedy of the character. He sees his own pattern with total clarity and still chooses isolation over risk again and again until isolation is simply what his life has become. He is offered a chance at real connection near the end of his account, and he destroys it deliberately, almost as if proving his own theory that he is undeserving of anything else. What makes this character so uncomfortable to read isn't that he's unlike us, it's that he's uncomfortably close to a version of ourselves we rarely admit to. Most people don't sabotage their lives through one spectacular act of self-destruction. They do it through a long series of quieter refusals, the apology they don't offer because pride feels safer than vulnerability, the opportunity they let pass because pursuing it would mean risking a failure they'd have to own, the love they hold at arm's length because closeness once cost them more than they were prepared to pay. Each refusal, taken alone, looks like caution. Taken together, they form a whole architecture of avoidance that starts to feel, eventually, like a personality rather than a pattern. There's a particular cruelty in how convincing the underground voice can sound. It rarely announces itself as fear. It dresses itself up as realism. This was never going to work anyway. People like me don't get things like that. Better to expect nothing than be disappointed. It borrows the language of wisdom to justify retreat. This is part of why the pattern is so difficult to interrupt. It doesn't feel like sabotage from the inside. It feels like protection, like good sense, like finally being smart enough not to fall for hope again. Consider a woman I'll call Priya, who had spent years describing herself, half-jokingly, as someone who simply wasn't lucky in relationships. Each time something promising began, she found a reason to pull back before it could deepen, a flaw she suddenly couldn't overlook, a inconvenient timing she decided was a sign, a fight she started over something trivial right as things were going well. From the outside, it looked like bad luck repeating itself. From the inside, it felt like instinct, like knowing better. It wasn't until a close friend gently pointed out the pattern, not the individual relationships, but the identical shape each of their endings took, that Priya could see what had actually been happening. She wasn't unlucky, she was protecting herself from a disappointment she'd decided, long before any of these relationships began, was inevitable. The protection had simply gotten so good at its job that it started attacking the very things it was meant to preserve. Recognizing this pattern in yourself is rarely a single dramatic epiphany. More often, it looks like catching yourself mid-sabotage just once and pausing instead of finishing the old sequence. Noticing the urge to pick the fight right as things are going well and choosing, just this once, to stay instead of retreat. This doesn't dissolve years of conditioning in a single choice, but it proves something the underground voice has spent a long time insisting isn't true, that a different response is actually possible. Chapter 3. The Freedom You Are Afraid of. There is a strange and uncomfortable truth buried inside the outsider feeling. Sometimes you are not a stranger to your life because it was taken from you. Sometimes you are a stranger to it because you quietly handed pieces of it away in exchange for something that felt safer than freedom. Dostoevsky explored this most powerfully through a parable about a figure called the Grand Inquisitor, who argues that most people don't actually want freedom at all. They find it unbearable. Given the choice between the terrifying openness of deciding for themselves who to be, what to believe, and how to live, Most people will trade that freedom for certainty, comfort, and someone else telling them the shape their life should take. Not because they are weak, but because freedom is heavier than it looks. Look at how often this plays out, quietly, without any grand religious framing at all. You take the path that was expected of you, the career, the relationship timeline, the personality, because someone else's certainty about who you should be felt so much lighter to carry than the terrifying blank page of deciding for yourself. You let other people's opinions of you set the boundaries of what you're allowed to want, because outsourcing the decision meant you never had to sit with the discomfort of choosing wrong on your own. This is one of the quiet mechanisms behind feeling like an outsider in your own life. You are, in a very real sense, living someone else's version of your freedom. A version curated by expectation, inherited belief, and the old childhood calculation of what kept you safe or approved of. And a version of you that never got to choose is never going to feel entirely like home, no matter how comfortable the furniture is. Think of a woman I'll call Renata. She had built what looked, from the outside, like an enviable life. A respected career in a field her parents had steered her towards since adolescence. A home in the neighborhood that signaled she'd made it. A calendar full of obligations that made her feel, at a glance, important. And she felt, almost constantly, like a visitor in her own house. It wasn't until a health scare forced her to stop moving for several weeks that Renata had enough silence to ask herself a question she'd avoided for 2 decades. If no one else's expectations were in this room right now, would I have chosen any of this? The honesty of the answer frightened her more than the health scare had. Not because the life was bad, but because so little of it had ever actually been decided by her. What Renata discovered next is the part most people skip past too quickly. The answer wasn't to burn the life down. It was smaller and slower than that. Reclaiming freedom one honest decision at a time. Renata didn't quit her career. She renegotiated her relationship to it, choosing, consciously, to stay in it for reasons that were finally her own rather than inherited ones. The outward life looked almost identical. The inward one had changed completely, because for the first time, she was living inside her own decision, instead of someone else's expectation, wearing her name. This is the part Dostoevsky insisted on that most self-help versions of freedom leave out. Freedom is not the absence of structure or responsibility. It's not running away from your life. It's the unbearable, necessary weight of knowing that your choices are actually yours, including the consequences of them. Most people flinch from that weight their entire lives, preferring the false comfort of, "I had no choice," to the frightening truth of, "I chose this, and I can choose differently." If you feel like an outsider in your own life, one honest question worth sitting with is this: how much of what fills your days did you actually choose? And how much did you simply inherit and never examine? You don't have to answer it all at once, but every time you choose one small thing deliberately, a boundary, an honest preference, a no you've been too afraid to say, you take back one more square foot of a life that had quietly stopped feeling like yours. It's worth being honest about why this trade feels so appealing in the first place. Freedom, when you actually look at it, is genuinely frightening. If your life is the product of your own choices, then so is its disappointment. There's no one else to hold responsible, no expectation to blame for the parts that don't fit. This is precisely what the Grand Inquisitor argues in Dostoevsky's parable, that people will trade almost anything, including their own dignity, for relief from that unbearable responsibility. Certainty is comfortable, freedom is not. And most people, most of the time, will choose comfort without ever admitting to themselves that's what they've done. This trade rarely announces itself so plainly. It doesn't feel like surrendering your freedom when it happens. It feels like being sensible, being realistic, following the path that everyone agrees makes sense. The inherited life rarely arrives as an obvious cage. It arrives disguised as good advice, repeated often enough by enough people you trust until it hardens into something that feels less like a choice you made and more like a law of nature you're simply following. This is part of why reclaiming freedom so rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It isn't usually about grand, visible rebellion, quitting the job, leaving the town, cutting off the family. Sometimes it is, but far more often it's something quieter and less photogenic. Staying in the same career, but for reasons you finally examined and chose yourself. Keeping the same relationships, but with boundaries that reflect what you actually want, rather than what keeps the peace. Remaining in the same city, but building a version of your life inside it that no longer runs entirely on other people's expectations. Freedom reclaimed often looks identical to the life you already had. What changes is who's actually driving it. There's also a subtler cost to inherited freedom worth naming. The way it slowly erodes your ability to know your own preferences at all. If you spend long enough letting other people's certainty decide the shape of your life, you can lose the muscle for knowing what you actually want, even in small, harmless decisions. Renata described this part of her recovery as the strangest, relearning in her 30s something as basic as what she actually enjoyed eating for dinner when no one else's preference was in the room. Freedom, once abandoned long enough, doesn't just disappear. The capacity to use it starts to atrophy too, and has to be rebuilt slowly, the same way any unused strength does. Chapter 4. The Watching Self. By now, the pattern should be coming into focus. There's a wound, the sense of being an outsider, and there are ways people learn to cope with that wound without ever actually healing it. This chapter is about the most common one, and the most invisible, the habit of watching your own life instead of living it. You've likely felt this, even if you've never had language for it. You're at an important moment, a celebration, a difficult conversation, a quiet evening that should feel meaningful, and some part of you steps back and starts narrating it instead of experiencing it. This is nice. I should be enjoying this more. Why do I feel like I'm watching this happen to someone else? The narrating voice feels like awareness, but it's actually distance. It's a way of staying just far enough from your own life that nothing can touch you too deeply, including the good things. Dostoevsky's characters often develop this same defensive detachment after enough disappointment or humiliation. They begin observing themselves from the outside because being fully present in their own experience has become too dangerous. Watching feels safer than being. If you're narrating your life instead of living it, nothing can catch you off guard. Nothing can hurt you the way it did before. The trouble is that this same defense that protects you from pain also quietly locks you out of joy, intimacy, and any sense that your life belongs to you. You cannot selectively numb. The same wall that keeps out devastation also keeps out delight. And so the outsider feeling deepens, not because your life got worse, but because you retreated one careful step further from actually inhabiting it. This is where modern psychology and Dostoevsky's fiction line up almost exactly. Researchers studying dissociation and emotional numbing described this same self-protective retreat, a nervous system pulling back from full presence because presence once cost too much. Self-compassion research adds an important piece here too. The antidote isn't forcing yourself back into raw vulnerability through sheer willpower, but slowly, gently, proving to yourself that presence is survivable again, in small enough doses that the old alarm system doesn't override you. There's a second, related coping mechanism worth naming here: control. If you can't trust the unpredictability of actually living, you can at least manage the optics of it, curating how your life looks from the outside, controlling every variable you can reach, so that even if you don't feel like you're inside your own story, at least the story looks convincing from the outside. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. It takes enormous energy to manage the appearance of a life you don't feel present inside. Consider a man I'll call Theo, who managed his entire existence like a project to be optimized. Every habit tracked. Every conversation, in some sense, performed with an eye toward how it would be received. He wasn't dishonest, exactly. He simply couldn't remember the last time he'd done something purely because he wanted to, rather than because it fit the version of himself he was curating. Control had become his substitute for presence. He was never surprised by his own life because he never let himself be present enough in it to be surprised. What eventually cracked Theo's control wasn't a disaster. It was something almost embarrassingly small. A friend, during an ordinary conversation, asked him, "But what do you actually want though? Not what makes sense. What do you want?" And Theo, for the first time in longer than he could remember, had no answer ready. The silence that followed was the most honest moment he'd had in years, precisely because it wasn't managed. The watching self and the controlling self are both, at bottom, attempts to survive a world that once felt unsafe to be fully present in. They are not evidence that you're broken or incapable of connection. They are evidence that you learned, somewhere along the way, that full presence came with a cost you couldn't afford at the time. The task now isn't to hate that old strategy, it's to notice, gently, that the cost calculation may no longer be true, and that presence, in small doses, might be survivable again. It's worth pausing on how respectable these coping mechanisms tend to look from the outside, which is part of why they're so hard to identify in yourself. The watching self often gets mistaken for maturity, the calm, composed person who never seems rattled, who observes rather than reacts. The controlling self often gets mistaken for competence, the person who has everything handled, whose life looks admirably organized. Both can earn real praise, real success, real external validation. This is exactly what makes them so difficult to give up. Why would you interrupt a strategy that's being rewarded, even if it's quietly costing you your own presence in the process? The honest answer is that you usually don't interrupt it voluntarily. Most people only start questioning the watching self or the controlling self when the cost finally outweighs the reward, when the exhaustion of managing everything becomes heavier than the comfort of managing it well. This is often a slow realization rather than a sudden one. You might notice it first as a kind of low-grade resentment that doesn't seem to have a clear target. Resentment at people who seem able to simply enjoy things without narrating them. Resentment at a life that looks successful and still feels distant. Resentment, if you're honest, at yourself for not being able to just relax into what you supposedly wanted. There's a particular version of this worth naming directly because it shows up so often in people who otherwise seem to be doing everything right. The inability to receive good things without immediately managing or minimizing them. A compliment gets deflected before it can land. An achievement gets discounted the moment it's real. A moment of genuine happiness gets interrupted by a private voice checking to make sure it isn't about to be taken away. This isn't humility, it's the watching self at work again, refusing to let anything, even good things, get close enough to matter. Because mattering is what makes loss possible. Theo's story didn't end with a single conversation about what he actually wanted. That question simply cracked something open that had been sealed for a long time. In the months that followed, he found himself repeatedly noticing the impulse to manage a moment instead of experiencing it, catching himself mid-sentence, curations a story about his weekend instead of just describing it honestly, and choosing, with visible effort at first, to leave the honest, unpolished version standing instead. He described the process not as suddenly becoming a different kind of person, but as slowly getting more comfortable being witnessed in an unfinished, uncontrolled state. That discomfort, he said, never fully went away. It just stopped being the thing that ran his life. Chapter 5. The night the mask cracked. Every performance has a limit. What Dostoevsky understood and dramatized again and again through characters driven nearly to collapse by the weight of their own concealment is that the false self can only be maintained for so long before something in the structure gives way. This is the chapter where the coping mechanisms from the last several sections stop working. The watching stops protecting you and starts isolating you completely. The control stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like a cage of your own careful construction. The performance that once kept you functioning starts to cost more than it gives back. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, something breaks. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It's not always a visible crisis. Sometimes it's simply the moment you can no longer perform the version of fine that has carried you this far. You're sitting in a meeting, or at a family dinner, or alone in your car in a parking lot, and the exhaustion of being someone you're not finally outweighs the fear of being seen as you actually are. And something in you stops. Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky's most famous character, reaches exactly this point. He commits a terrible act and spends the rest of the story constructing an elaborate performance of composure around it, convincing himself and everyone around him that he is unaffected, rational, in control. But the psychological cost of that performance grows heavier with every page, until his body itself begins to betray him. Fever, collapse, a mind that can no longer hold the weight of the lie it's been asked to carry. He becomes, in his own words, a stranger to everyone he loves, isolated not by circumstance, but by the unbearable effort of pretending. And the breaking point, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive as strength. It arrives as total collapse, a moment where he can no longer distinguish the performed self from whatever remains underneath it. This is the part most people fear most about their own version of this moment. The belief that if the mask cracks, there will be nothing underneath it. That the performance isn't hiding a self, it is the self, and beneath it is just emptiness. This fear is almost never true, and it is worth saying directly. The collapse of a false self is not the discovery of no self. It is the discovery of the self that was buried underneath the performance the entire time, still intact, simply unused for a very long time. Let's return to Daniel from the first chapter, the man who hadn't said a fully honest sentence about his inner life in nearly 2 years. His breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. His partner asked gently why he seemed distant lately, and Daniel opened his mouth to give the practiced non-answer he'd given 100 times before. "I'm fine, just tired," and found that his throat physically would not produce the lie. Not out of some dramatic act of courage, his body simply refused to keep performing. What came out instead, halting and unpolished, was the truth. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't think I've been honest with you or with myself in a very long time. I'm scared of what that means." That sentence cost Daniel more than almost anything he'd ever said. It also, within seconds, changed everything. His partner didn't recoil. She said, quietly, "I've been waiting 2 years for you to say something true." Daniel had spent 2 years protecting a relationship from a version of honesty that, when it finally arrived, was the thing the relationship had actually been starving for. This is the turning point that Dostoevsky returns to again and again in his fiction. The moment collapse is mistaken for the end, when it is almost always the beginning. The mask cracking is not the destruction of you. It is the destruction of a version of you that was never sustainable, making room, often for the first time in years, for the version that was buried underneath. If you are near this point yourself, exhausted by a performance you no longer have the strength to maintain, this is the hardest and most important thing to hear. You are not failing by reaching this edge. You are arriving somewhere necessary. The people worth keeping in your life are not going to reject the truth of you. They have very likely been waiting quietly the entire time for exactly the sentence you've been too afraid to say. The mask does not have infinite structural integrity. Eventually, honestly, it cannot. And on the other side of that crack is not nothing. It is you. Tired, frightened, finally visible. And for the first time in longer than you can remember, no longer a stranger in your own life. It's worth being honest about how frightening this moment actually feels while it's happening, because minimizing that fear doesn't help anyone move through it. There is real terror in the instant before the mask cracks, a conviction that, once the performance stops, whatever comes next will be worse than the exhaustion of maintaining it. This fear isn't irrational. For some people, in some relationships, honesty really has been met with punishment, withdrawal, or ridicule in the past. The nervous system doesn't forget those lessons easily, and it's reasonable that some part of you would rather keep performing than risk confirming that old fear was right all along. This is why the breaking point so often arrives not through a sudden burst of courage, but through simple depletion, the performance becoming, quite literally, more exhausting to maintain than the fear of what happens without it. Nobody wakes up one morning and bravely decides to stop pretending. More often, the pretending simply runs out of fuel. The body, as Dostoevsky understood so intimately through his own characters, tends to keep the score long after the mind has stopped consciously counting. Sleep gets harder, small tasks start to feel disproportionately heavy. A kind of flatness settles in that no amount of external success seems to touch. These are not signs of weakness. They are the last available signals a system has left, when every quieter one has already been ignored. There is also a specific and important distinction worth making here, because this chapter can be misread as glorifying collapse itself. The value isn't in the breakdown for its own sake. Pain is not proof of depth, and suffering isn't a badge to chase. The value is in what the breakdown makes possible once it's happened. The end of a performance that could no longer sustain itself, and the opening, however frightening, of space for something truer to take its place. Collapse isn't the goal, it's simply, for many people, the threshold they have to cross before the goal becomes reachable at all. What happened after Daniel's admission is worth dwelling on a little longer, because the immediate aftermath is rarely as clean as a single good conversation. In the weeks that followed, there were harder conversations, older resentments that surfaced now that the general silence had broken. Moments where his partner needed reassurance that this honesty wasn't a prelude to leaving. Moments where Daniel himself doubted whether he'd done the right thing by finally speaking. None of that undid the value of the original moment. It simply confirms something true about this kind of turning point. It doesn't resolve everything at once. It opens a door. What happens afterward still has to be lived, slowly, one honest conversation at a time. Chapter 6. The Confession. There is a reason Dostoevsky built so many of his stories around confession. Not confession as punishment, but confession as the doorway back into your own life. Raskolnikov's entire arc turns on this. He spends most of the novel running from the truth of what he did, constructing increasingly elaborate justifications, isolating himself further with every lie he tells to protect the performance of innocence. And nothing in the story resolves. Not his guilt, not his exile from the people who love him, not the outsider status he's exiled himself into, until he finally, painfully, tells the truth out loud. Not to escape punishment, to escape the much heavier sentence of permanent self-estrangement. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes something most people get backward. We tend to think honesty is dangerous and silence is safe. Dostoevsky argued the opposite. Silence about who you actually are is the thing slowly making you a stranger to your own life. And honesty, however frightening in the moment, is the only road that leads back to yourself. Confession, in this sense, doesn't require a courtroom or a crime. It can be as small as finally telling a friend you're not actually fine, as telling a partner what you actually want instead of what you think they want to hear, as admitting to yourself in the quiet of your own mind that a choice you've defended for years was actually made out of fear, not conviction. Every one of these small honesties is a return trip toward the self you've been keeping at a distance. This lines up with something confession-adjacent research keeps finding in modern contexts too, that naming a hidden truth to another person, even a small and unglamorous one, measurably reduces the isolating weight of carrying it alone. The relief isn't about being forgiven, it's about no longer needing to manage the gap between the self you show and the self you are. Dostoevsky was careful never to suggest that confession fixes everything instantly. Raskolnikov's honesty doesn't erase what happened or immediately dissolve his suffering. It does something more foundational. It reconnects him to the possibility of being known rather than merely observed. And it's only from that reconnected place that anything like healing becomes possible at all. There is also, in Dostoevsky's view, a form of dignity in this that has nothing to do with approval. A person's worth, he insisted throughout his work, does not depend on being impressive, composed, or admired. Even his most humiliated, degraded characters retain something unkillable in them, a core worth that humiliation can bruise but never fully erase. This matters enormously for the outsider feeling, because so much of the performance you've been maintaining was likely built on a quiet, false belief that the honest, unpolished version of you isn't enough to be loved. Dostoevsky's entire body of work argues the opposite. Dignity survives humiliation. Worth was never something you had to earn through performance in the first place. Faith enters here too, in a form that has nothing to do with certainty. Dostoevsky didn't write faith as the absence of doubt. He wrote it as a willingness to keep moving forward through doubt without demanding total certainty first. This applies directly to reclaiming your own life. You are not going to feel completely sure of your reclaimed, honest self overnight. The confidence comes after the practice, not before it. What's asked of you isn't certainty, it's the willingness to keep choosing honesty, even while you're still uncertain what it will cost you. There's an important nuance here that's easy to miss. Confession, in this sense, is not the same as constant disclosure. It doesn't mean announcing every private struggle to everyone in your life, or treating honesty as a performance of its own. Some things are appropriately private. Some truths belong only to you, or only to a therapist, or only to the one person closest to you. The point isn't indiscriminate transparency. It's the much narrower, more important discipline of no longer actively lying to others, and especially to yourself, about who you are and what you actually feel. There's a real difference between privacy and concealment. Privacy is a boundary you choose. Concealment is a wall you hide behind because the truth feels too dangerous to let anyone, including yourself, get near. This distinction matters because it removes a common excuse for avoiding the work altogether. The idea that becoming honest means becoming an open book, exposing every vulnerability indiscriminately, which understandably sounds unbearable to most people. That was never what Dostoevsky was describing. Raskolnikov's confession wasn't a public spectacle. It was one honest reckoning, first with himself, then with the handful of people whose knowing him mattered most. The rest of the world didn't need his full story. He simply needed to stop running from it inside his own mind. Consider how this played out for Priya from the earlier chapter about self-sabotage. Her path back toward honesty didn't begin with some grand relational confession. It began privately, a journal entry, unglamorous and unread by anyone else, where she wrote out for the first time the actual pattern she'd been repeating instead of the story she'd been telling herself about bad luck. That single act of private honesty didn't fix anything by itself, but it was the first moment in years she'd described her own behavior accurately instead of protectively. Everything that came after, the honest conversation with the friend who'd noticed the pattern, the decision to stay rather than retreat the next time things went well, traced back to that one unglamorous private admission. This is worth remembering if the idea of confession feels too large or too frightening to attempt all at once. It doesn't have to start with the hardest conversation you can imagine. It can start smaller than that. An honest sentence to yourself, written down or simply thought clearly, that doesn't flinch away from what's actually true. Dostoevsky's characters rarely arrive at their most important confessions in a single leap. They circle the truth for pages, for chapters, sometimes for the better part of a novel, before they're finally able to say it plainly. The circling isn't failure. It's often necessary groundwork, the mind working up the strength for a truth the heart already knows. This is the quiet turn the whole video has been building toward. The outsider feeling was never a life sentence. It was a signal, a part of you refusing to let the performance become permanent. Confession, honesty, small acts of truth-telling are how you answer that signal instead of silencing it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently enough that the gap between the self you perform and the self you are finally starts to close. Resolution and integration. Nothing about this process resolves the way a tidy story would like it to. You do not wake up one morning fully integrated, free of the underground voice, immune to the pull of the mask. Dostoevsky never offered that kind of ending to any of his characters, and it would be dishonest to offer it to you. What he offered instead, and what's actually available to you, is something quieter and more durable. The slow, uneven, entirely real experience of becoming less of a stranger to your own life, one honest choice at a time. Daniel and his partner did not arrive at some perfected relationship after his confession. They arrived at a harder, more honest one, full of the awkwardness of two people learning to speak plainly to each other after years of practiced distance. Renata did not abandon the life her choices had built. She rebuilt her relationship to it from the inside, so that the same external structure finally belonged to her. Theo did not stop being a person who liked order and control. He simply stopped using control as a wall against being known. This is what integration actually looks like. Not a dramatic before and after, a quiet renegotiation with your own life, carried out in small moments most people would never notice from the outside. The honest answer instead of the practiced one. The boundary held even when it's uncomfortable. The decision made because you actually want it rather than because it's expected. The underground voice does not disappear completely. It softens over time as it's fed less and obeyed less. But you will likely still hear it. The old pull towards sabotage right when something good arrives. The flicker of fear before an honest sentence. The difference after this work is that you'll recognize the voice for what it is, an old, frightened protector, not the final authority on who you are or what you deserve. The freedom that once felt unbearably heavy starts, slowly, to feel more like yours to carry, not because it gets lighter, but because you stop resenting the weight of choices that are actually your own instead of inherited ones. Watching gives way in small increments to presence. Control gives way in small increments to trust. None of this happens on a schedule. Some days the old patterns will feel stronger than the new ones. That's not failure. Dostoevsky's own characters relapse into old patterns constantly. The difference between them and the version of themselves at the start of the story is not that they stopped struggling, but that they stopped mistaking the struggle for proof they were unworthy of a better life. What quietly changes underneath all of it is your relationship to your own inner life. You stop treating the discomfort of feeling like an outsider as evidence that something is wrong with you, and start treating it as what it actually is, a compass pointing you back toward a self you'd started to abandon. Guilt in this framework is not a life sentence, it's information. The ache of feeling unseen is not proof you're unlovable. It's proof that some part of you is still waiting, patiently, to be let back into the room. This is not a story that ends in triumph. It ends in something better suited to an actual life, a hard-won, sober kind of peace. The peace of no longer needing to perform yourself for an audience, including the harshest audience of all, which was always the one inside your own head. The peace of a life that finally feels inhabited, even on the days it's difficult, because difficulty lived honestly is still yours, in a way that comfort performed for others never was. There is a particular kind of relief that comes not from arriving anywhere final, but from simply putting down a weight you'd carried for so long you'd forgotten it was optional. That's closer to what this integration actually feels like than any dramatic transformation. Less like becoming a new person, more like finally being permitted to be the person who was there all along, underneath years of careful management. It's worth naming honestly that this path will cost you some things, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Some relationships built entirely around your performed self may not survive contact with the honest version of you, and that loss is real and worth grieving rather than minimizing. Some opportunities that only made sense for the curated version of your life may fall away as you stop maintaining them. Dostoevsky never suggested that honesty comes free. He suggested only that its cost is smaller and far more bearable than the slow, compounding cost of permanent self-estrangement, the cost of spending an entire life as a stranger inside your own story. What tends to remain, and often deepens, are the relationships and pursuits that were never actually about the performance in the first place. The people who, it turns out, wanted the honest version of you all along, and simply never had access to it before. This is usually the most quietly moving part of the process for the people who go through it. They expected honesty to cost them connection. More often, it's the thing that finally makes real connection possible, because you cannot actually be fully known by anyone while you're still hiding the truest parts of yourself from them. You will still have days where the old distance creeps back in. That does not undo the work. It simply means there's another honest choice waiting on the other side of that day, the same as there always has been. The self you buried under years of performance is patient. It has been waiting this whole time. It is not going anywhere. And every time you choose truth over performance, even in some small, unglamorous way nobody else will ever notice, you take one more quiet step out of exile and back into the one life that was always actually yours. If this video found you at a moment when you've been feeling far away from your own life, you are not alone in that, and you are not broken for feeling it. Dostoevsky spent a lifetime writing toward the same ache because he lived inside it himself, and he never once suggested it made a person less worthy of the life waiting on the other side of it. If something in this reached you, consider staying a little longer in this channel. There's a whole reservoir of his ideas we haven't gotten to yet. And if you know someone who's been quietly performing a version of themselves for far too long, this might be the video that finds them at the right moment too. Not because they need fixing, because sometimes all a person needs is to hear that the ache they've never said out loud has a name, and an ending that doesn't require them to disappear to reach it. You walk into the room, and for the first time in longer than you can remember, you don't stand 3 feet behind yourself watching a performance. You are simply there, tired, honest, imperfect, and finally, unmistakably, home in your own life.